One factor is responsible for the rise of civilization, for economic progress and, in its absence, for civilization's collapse. In the absence of one single factor or its marginalization, ensures that society will stagnate or head towards collapse. This factor is, in its pure form, faith, but this is not something people, Christian or not, understand, and so we will discuss a corollary or factor that results from faith. Faith produces works of faith, and this fruit is civilization. We see these works primarily in the form of physical things. But there is a long way to go from chipped arrowheads to cell phones. Some cultures barely get to the stone tool stage. And so, we need to ask, what is the difference between, say, Britain and the Bushmen? Both innovate, both have some level of social trust to create social cohesion, but why is one the center of the civilized world and the other barely known? At this point we can list every feature we can think of as having some degree of causality, because the two cultures are so distinct. But we would not be much the wiser after this is done, because even if we told the Bushmen about England or took them there to see for themselves what England is, it is unlikely the Bushmen could create an industrial revolution upon returning home. But of course, economic development came way before the age of machines. It is not just that some cultures do not understand machinery, they cannot systemize the making of the least technological of implements. Of course they do not need to at the lowest level of subsistence culture, but they are at this level because they never took the next step towards industrialization. It is not that there are cultures that never developed tools or sophisticated processes for dealing with raw materials. Every society is highly sophisticated compared to what animals do. But some nations went through the stages of development much faster than some, and they did not stop innovating. We have said the key difference is faith. This is so, because if you cannot trust your neighbors to respect your right to the labor one has invested in a process, the labor is likely to remain unexpended. However, this is not the time to dissect why some cultures are more trusting than others. In any case, the problem is not an issue of personality differences or genetic. If the problem was that simple, many Western nations would not be struggling with economic development now, when it was not a problem in the past. In fact, the West, or large portions of it, has been fighting against the process that leads to economic development for so long. It is amazing that progress is still going on. Consider a common problem infecting every Western nation: the high price of homes. It is almost impossible for an average person to buy a home, and if one is purchased, to pay off the mortgage. This means that relative to income or the ability of a person to build a home or have someone build one, homes have increased in price to a substantial degree. This is what we have become accustomed to. And this is true for most products, other than electronics, which see price declines relative to the specifications. But economic development requires people to be able to purchase the labor of others. This is part of the faith equation. There are two problems, related to faith. Either we fear others will take what we produce, or they will not. Either way, our labor goes unrewarded. And so the problem in undeveloped regions is not just the fear of being robbed, scammed, or deprived of one's labor, it is the fear that the investment one makes will not bear fruit. But why is that? Why ought someone who is willing to work, and even invest their time and talent in exploring new innovative ways of doing things, be anxious about if he will reap the rewards of his labor? There is a group of persons who are, for want of a better word, liberal. They do not think the law applies to them. These people have or think they have a get-out-of-jail-free card. They are, in the terminology of the day, privileged. This privilege is usually voiced in the language of rights. They have human rights, or trans rights, or some other bundle of rights that entitles them to what they did not work for. If we were all equal, we would not have rights. Rights are an entitlement, and we cannot be entitled if we all have the same rights. We might claim to have the same rights, but the only rights we can truly have that we all have equally, is the right to what we produce or create. We have no right to what others have done, which means we are not in a position to make claims on them or what they have. What does a right to life mean other than others are obliged to utilize what they have for your benefit? But we are told to look at the beam in our own eye before we worry about the straw in the eye of others. There are also several verses about forgiveness, about giving to people in need and so on, that together tells us to stop worrying about correcting others and focus on the perfecting of self. The Bible, and Christians, rightly point out that we are in sin and technically are incapable of perfection, but the Bible also says that with man, no one can be saved, but with God, everything is possible. Matthew 19 verses 25 to 26. When his disciples heard it, they were exceedingly amazed, saying, Who then can be saved? But Jesus beheld them, and said unto them, With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. This means there is a cheat code or a way out of what for man is an impasse. We find the solution in Matthew 18 verses 15 to 20. Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church, but if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say unto you, that if 2 of you shall agree on earth as touching any thing that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. We cannot be perfected as individuals, but as the church our sins are hidden in Christ. All that Jesus says about the church and our need for fellowship is not said as a bit of worldly wisdom or psychological advice. Being bound to the church is vital for our salvation. The church is vital to our faith and a natural outgrowth of faith. If we believe in Jesus, we will believe in his people, and if we believe in his people, we will do works of faith that builds the church. The church is the fruit of our faith and the product of our good works. But what has this to do with economic development? As we come together to build the church, so do we need to come together to reproduce economic development. We cannot be the church and be fruitless, and we cannot be fruitful and not be what is tantamount to the church. Romans 2 verses 12 to 16. For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which shew the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the mean, while accusing or else excusing one another winky face. In the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. And so it all comes down to those who do good works and those who do not, for these are the ones who bear fruit or do not. This is the thing which divides us into sheep and goats, into the saved and unsaved, the spirit and the flesh, and into those who are spiritually mature and the rest. So, we see that faith leads to works and works leads to the fruits of the Spirit. We create value. Conversely, those who do not bear fruit must still live, and so how do they live but as parasites? This was the problem with the scribes and Pharisees and those who served the state. They produce no good works and are parasites. However, we are not done yet, for we still need to burrow down deeper to truly understand economic development. Think first of a community living on the edge as a subsistence culture. Everyone works yet still only has the basics needed to survive. In this environment there can be no, or little parasitism, so we see no governments or investors or rentiers and so on. What it takes to have economic development is the same thing it takes to have parasites. We need deflation. To produce a surplus, things need to be produced with fewer inputs. The crucial step in the Industrial Revolution was not the development of factories, but the production of surplus food, so people could come off the land and staff the factories. One farmer could produce 10 times as much for the same labor, and so food costs declined, not by a factor of 10 but substantially. This is deflation. As factories were created and machines developed, huge investments were made in machinery to increase the output of farms. We do not see the lower cost always in the actual cost of food on the store shelves, but a large amount does not go to the farmer but to other people for their work in making machines and other inputs. As technology begins to produce technology and more machines are created that produce machines, deflation increases. Increased productivity is deflation in action. Deflation is always accompanied by specialization. People do more and more things that are only indirectly related to what people finally consume. At one time one man would build a house, now thousands are involved and many factories that produce countless specialized products that now go into the finished product. Deflation is not always seen at the level of individual products, where it becomes visible in the life of the family. The standard of living of the average household improves. The rate of improvement equals the rate of deflation. Technically, the standard of living ought to improve exponentially, but there is a drag on the process, and this is where evil enters the picture. Evil is not some mystical force that cannot be identified or defined. It is empirically accessible, meaning it contains a quantifiable component. Evil in its economic manifestation is inflation and can be connected to everything which produces inflation or, in the opposite sense, hinders or reduces deflation. It is not that man has a right to prosperity, it is that if man lives according to the Bible, it happens as a natural consequence. Indeed, there is no need to reference God to understand that if you have millions of people working together honestly and without guile, the world will prosper. No one conclusion is possible. And so we conclude that the secret to economic development is people looking into their lives and ending any examples of parasitism. The corollary to this is that we must pay everyone for the labor they produce and make no claims on any value not produced by us. In other words, deflationary activity produces civilization, and parasitism ends it as it ends economic development and prosperity. Those are the inversely related factors. Now it is up to you to decide what you wish to do about it.